Welcome to Gracefully Graying. I'm your host, attorney Henry Gorenvine. Please visit our Gracefully Graying YouTube channel as well as gracefullygraying.com, where we have all of our videos, blogs, and so much more information. Today on Gracefully Graying, I'm pleased to welcome as my guest a very prominent attorney who specializes in all aspects of estate planning, probate, as well as family law. She's a senior partner with the Lipson Neilson law firm. Without further ado, let me welcome Sandra Glazier. Sandy, welcome to Gracefully Graying.
Thanks, Henry. Nice to be here.
First of all, Sandy, tell our viewers a little bit about your current areas of specialization with Lipson Neilson.
Well, Henry, I concentrate my practice in estate planning, probate litigation, trust and estate administration, and family law. I also hold leadership roles with trust and estates committees within the American Bar Association. I'm on the Notre Dame Tax Advisory board for their Estate Planning Institute and on the advisory board for Trust and Estates magazine. I also recently co-authored the ABA's book on undue influence and vulnerable adults. I'm the only female equity partner at Lipson Neilson. So as you know, I've been practicing for quite a while. And this
Not
is
that
an
long.
area started in the 70s with a judge in Oakland County. So it's been a while, and I enjoy what I do, and I try to really make a difference, not only in individuals' lives, but in teaching other lawyers important things about representing vulnerable adults.
Tell us, what is undue influence as we frame our talk?
Well, undue influence is, generally speaking, a psychological process. It occurs over a period of time, and it results in the will of an individual being supplanted or overcome by that of another. Frequently, it isn't a single event where somebody just tells you to do something and you do it. It involves a grooming process. It involves a period of time over which dependence on an individual may occur. It generally happens in private, outside the purview of other witnesses, and it can really happen to anybody. Even the most astute business individual can find themselves in a situation where there's a shift in the power paradigm, meaning where they were in control before, but because of circumstances that were either foreseen or unforeseen, they're no longer sitting in the driver's seat. So we often believe we can withstand the influence of another, stand our ground, and not be unduly influenced. But under the right set of circumstances, even the brightest and strong-willed individuals can be subjected to undue influence. And what that generally results in is an individual engaging in a transaction or behavior that is very different than what historically would have occurred.
Sandy, how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted upon the ability of undue influence to occur?
Well, Henry, there are a number of red flags that have been identified as making an individual susceptible to undue influence. And two key circumstances are isolation and dependency. Any kind of vulnerability really can make one more susceptible. Things like mental illness, depression, loss of a loved one, and fear of changes in living circumstances are all additional factors that have been identified as making individuals more susceptible to undue influence. COVID has made all of us more isolated. It's by necessity. It doesn't take somebody doing something wrong to create the circumstances that make somebody vulnerable to undue influence. So COVID by itself, because we have to isolate from family and friends, shelter in place, not engage in behaviors that we historically might have engaged in that kept us connected to other individuals and kept us really active and viable. Like people going to group classes or playing bridge or interacting with their family. All those things have taken a back seat during the time of COVID because this disease is just so dangerous to vulnerable adults. And all of that, right, feeds into those factors that make us more susceptible to undue influence. People may be afraid of what will happen if they catch the disease. They may even be afraid if they've had it, what the long-term effects may be. And they may have lost loved ones, or loved ones may not be able to visit them anymore because they are either vulnerable or they don't want to accidentally bring the disease into a family member's home. So all of those factors create fertile ground for undue influence to occur. And it doesn't have to be with wrongful intent. It can just happen naturally as we become more and more isolated and dependent.
Sandy, who does the CDC or Center for Disease Control identify as perhaps being more vulnerable to the stresses of this pandemic?
Well, the CDC has updated their website, and they indicate people who are at higher risk of severe illness as a result of COVID, such as older people or people of any age who have certain underlying medical conditions, are considered to be more vulnerable to the stresses of the pandemic. People caring for family members or loved ones. Frontline workers such as healthcare providers and first responders are under tremendous stress these days. Essential workers who work in the food industry, those who can't work like we do, Henry, remotely. We're doing this program via Zoom, but there are people who are frontline workers who have to go out and they live under the fear of being exposed to COVID. People who use substances, who have substance abuse diseases or disorders are more susceptible to the stresses. People may have suffered a major change in their employment, whether it's a loss of income or a loss of job. People are food dependent right now. They have some insufficiencies. People are food lines who've never been there before. People with disabilities. People are socially isolated from others, including those who live alone and people in rural or frontier areas. People in certain racial and ethnic minority groups because they've been hit harder with the ravages of the disease. And those people who don't have access to information in their primary language can be more fearful because they don't have current and accurate information. Also, people who live in congregate and group settings. A lot of seniors who live even in independent apartments in a congregate environment have had lockdowns and aren't able to have the same kind of interaction they historically had. And there's been a lot of COVID in nursing homes and facilities. So people are more fearful. I have clients who are calling me who've lived in luxury apartments who want to get out because they're afraid to even go in the elevator, that they might catch COVID by going into the elevator. So they're so fearful, they're really becoming shut-ins in their own apartments. So, these are the groups that the CDC has identified, but there are many individuals who are feeling the stresses of this virus.
Sandy, how does COVID make individuals more dependent on those persons with whom they might be interacting with?
Well, historically, people may have been able to do things for themselves. They went shopping. They went out and they were able to initiate social interaction. They could go visit their grandchildren. They could go visit their friends. They could go visit family members. They could travel. They might have gone for physical activity. They might have gone, you mentioned that you did a segment on yoga. They might have gone to a yoga class or a meditation class or done something where now they can't do those things. And they may not be computer savvy. So even to get a doctor's appointment, sign up for a COVID vaccine now, which you primarily need to do via the internet. Interact with individuals. If they don't know how to connect themselves, if they're unable to go to the grocery store, if they're unable to deal with their needs, if they had numerous family members who would be able to come in and help them before, but now because a child or family member may have an underlying illness or condition that makes them more vulnerable, so they're not going out, they may become dependent on a single or smaller group of individuals to assist them.
Sandy, how has isolation impacted on these issues that you've been discussing?
Well, isolation is, can impact our reserves, right? Isolation and dependency are two commonly recognized factors that make individuals more susceptible to undue influence. And some adults have great reserves and resilience, and they may be faring fairly well. In fact, there was a study in the Netherlands, although it was a small group study, that said some older adults were dealing better with the isolation because they were used to spending long periods of time by themselves than some younger people. But on a whole, there's approximately 45% of adults have been reported to the Kaiser Family Foundation, who's been looking into this issue, that they are having mental health issues resulting from the stresses and strains of the pandemic. So these isolation, the stresses and strains, gives rise to concern, because those are all factors, Henry, that can make us more vulnerable to undue influence.
Sandy, tell us some features to help people stay more connected during the difficult times that we've been going through really for 10 months now.
Well, keeping connected is really important, Henry. The good news is we've got a lot of platforms. Today we're on Zoom. If you have a family member who's not computer savvy, if they have an Android or another phone, if you can get an app on the phone, like FaceTime or Google Duo or Google Hangouts, Facebook Messenger, Line, Viber, Tango, Skype, WhatsApp, or Marco Polo, and there are many others. If you can teach them how to operate, because some of these, it's just tapping on the picture of the individual and it will call so they can have a video conference with somebody else. That interaction and being able to see somebody face to face is really important. It's not the same as being there in person, but it permits family members to make observations. It permits the individual to interact. We're social beings, so we need to be able to find ways in order to keep us mentally healthy to interact with other individuals. And for the elderly, that's particularly important. So if you can't do that, right, then because some people are just really technologically challenged, then you may be left with the phone or meeting outside, 6 feet apart. But that's harder here in Michigan, right? When we get into the winter months, it's harder for the elderly to bundle themselves up, go outside on the deck and interact with somebody else. But to the extent that you can keep interaction going, and we're lucky we live in a time where these apps are available, these can be really helpful tools.
Sandy, once dependency has been established, how difficult is it to break this link?
Well, because dependency can be as a result of a psychological circumstance. It can be because of physical reasons as well. It's really hard to break that. An elderly person who was driving, short distances before COVID, but now is fearful of going out in public, may lose some of their driving skills. And that may make them, over a longer period of time, dependent on individuals who are bringing them food or bringing them their necessities. If the only way they can communicate with people is via the internet, and you have to have somebody in your house to help you do that, that can make you very dependent on that individual. You know, this dependency, when it goes on for a long period of time, can cause people to lose confidence in their own abilities and make them fearful to do things on their own, to try to re-engage in activities that they were doing before COVID. So, or even afraid that they'll lose, if they become so enmeshed with the person who's been providing assistance, they may become fearful of losing that connection with the person that's provided that support. So all of those psychological factors can make it very difficult to break the dependency.
Sandy, you alluded to earlier in our conversation, but let's touch more upon adults moving from congregate settings to moving in with family or single-story dwellings with their own aides.
Well, there's a lot of people who are saying, you know, even family members, let's get mom or dad out of that facility, right? It's not safe. They had a lot of COVID there. Or we're fearful they'll have a COVID outbreak. There are people who are in those settings who are fearful and want to get out. It may be great to live with family, but there are pros and cons to it, right? So when you... Sometimes it's the interaction that's the con,
we can't
right?
pick our relatives.
Right? So, you know, we could get along really well with our family when we're seeing them for, you know, periods of time with breaks in between. It might not work as well when they're living in your household, right? And, you know, then you've got clashes going on. But you know, besides that, look, when you're in a congregate setting, you've got a social network, you've got third-party eyes viewing what's going on, right? Those can be protections against undue influence under certain circumstances. There's no fail-safe against undue influence. I'm just saying these are factors that can help, you know, individuals. But, you know, when you're closed in your own apartment, that can lead to isolation. Being in a family member's home, but others not being able to visit because of COVID, that can lead to isolation. When you're in a congregate setting, there may be multiple caregivers who are coming and checking on you, you know, providing some checks and balances, where once you're in the home, there may be no checks and balances as to what's going on. And let's face it, not every family member treats their family well. In fact, most elder abuse is occasioned by caregivers and family members. So, you know, these are the pros and cons of there's no perfect environment for somebody to live in, especially during COVID.
Sandy, give us some examples of undue influence and the results of undue influence.
Well, I've had a lot of cases, so I'm just going to pick one situation.
Okay.
You know, so I had, well, let's talk about this before we get to the example. A friend or family member can make an individual feel so dependent that the fear of losing that person, I think I mentioned this before, may result in them succumbing to comments that can elevate that person's importance and result in negative opinions being formed about another. You know, by way of example, you know, Johnny used to be here all the time. He's never around anymore. Well, Johnny may not be able to be there because of COVID, right? Or he may have to take care of other family members. So the family decided to split responsibility for mom or dad. Well, if the person responsible for mom or dad starts making a lot of negative comments about the family members who aren't there, because they're feeling the pressure of taking care of mom or dad. Mom or dad is now with them 24/7, right? And that can be stressful for the caregiver, right? The caregiver may not intentionally be influencing mom or dad's opinion of other family members, but they can be inadvertently doing that in a way that gets ingrained, right? Especially people who have cognitive issues. That may be what they remember. They don't remember all the things the family did before. They only remember the immediate things that are going on and the comments that they're hearing on a regular basis. That can become ingrained. An example of that was I had an elderly client who was in a very well-known adult community in Florida. But he had a daughter who had some significant health issues, and she wasn't able to go and visit him. And that was pre-COVID. So the community provides a lot of support and caregivers who can come in on an as-needed basis. Now, one of these people came in, started providing care, was very flattering, very helpful. At first, everybody thought she was great, but she was ingratiating herself. She was grooming this individual. And over a period of time, she started vacationing with him and going everywhere he went and narrowing his circle of friends. And, you know, he was very lonely and lost his spouse. Over time, she was able to convince him that she was the only one who cared about his well-being. And in the facility, the adult community, when they terminated her and brought charges against her because of things that she was doing, she was able to convince him, no, their only goal is to keep you from being happy and to separate us. So he was so, it's almost like brainwashing, Henry, you know, like, so he believed
Literally,
that the person who was really abusing him financially, because undue influence is a form of financial elder abuse. So she was getting cars and jewelry and gifts and having him gift money to her family. She was able to really turn him against anybody, the authorities, his family. He wanted to move out of the community where he lived for decades, because she was able to convince him that she was the only one who cared, and his happiness depended upon her. He would be lonely and without anyone if she wasn't there. And these are the types of things that can happen when people are isolated and become dependent and become wrapped up. They can become victims, right? They can have, they're groomed over time, and they don't realize that this is what's happening, because it happens in such a subtle way over an extended period of time, where there's increased dependency and entwinement with that individual.
Sandy, how can we reduce the potential effect of future undue influence?
Well, one of the things I like to talk to my clients about is Ulysses clauses. And you might recall the book of the Odyssey, where Homer told about Ulysses' journey home after the Trojan Wars. He had to go through an area where the sirens existed. And the sirens, the voice of the sirens, you know, would draw the sailor in, and they were never to be seen again, right? It drew them to their death. So Ulysses wanted to hear the sound because it was supposed to be a beautiful sound. So he made a pact with his men. They put wax in their ears, and Ulysses asked them to tie him to the mast and not listen to any direction he might tell them when they went through this area. So he couldn't break the bonds, and they wouldn't deviate from their course, so they couldn't be lured by the sirens. Well, that's where the Ulysses clause came from, right? So we can put into our estate planning documents protective provisions that when certain events occur, when you hit a certain age, that recognizing that the older we get, or a variety of circumstances can make us more vulnerable, that a trusted individual or individuals, a committee even, can be put into place, and if they want to change their trust provisions, that they have to get the consent of those individuals. Now, those individuals could have a vested interest in not wanting that person to change their estate plan. So you always want to provide the out of permitting them to go to court, so that if they can convince the court that their desired changes are the result of the exercise of their free will and that they have the capacity to make those changes, they'll still be able to make those changes. But it's a way of having the sailors, right, protect you and tie you to the mast so that you don't succumb to the influence of another unwillingly, that results in your estate plan being changed in a way that wouldn't have been consistent with your historical desires.
Sandy, what about a Ulysses clause in a medical designation or power of attorney?
Those have become common in some states where, you say, I don't want X, Y, and Z treatment, right? You may even still have capacity, right? So you're saying, no, I don't want to go into the psych ward, but you really need that help. You can include a Ulysses clause that under certain circumstances, even if I say no, the person who I've delegated authority to make decisions when I'm not competent can overrule my no and make sure that I get the medical treatment that I need. It's not a withdrawal of treatment. It's the ability, the Ulysses clause in the medical power is one that permits treatment to occur, not withdraw to permit you to die, because, that's the dynamics we're dealing with there.
Sandy, we're running down to a minute. What are some other safeguards that you can recommend, and then share some final thoughts with our viewers before we sign off?
Well, Henry, unfortunately, there's no absolute safeguard when it comes to undue influence. But as I said, keeping in contact with family members, friends, maintaining a core group of trusted advisors, making sure they are able to openly communicate. So if one sees a concern, they can communicate it to others, are all things that can help. And documenting observations, having family members and advisors document their observations, are all things that can be helpful in addressing undue influence. Undue influence, Henry's has been called the crime of the 21st century. 1 in 10 people over the age of 60 have reported being subjected to financial elder abuse. And as I indicated, undue influence is a form of financial elder abuse. Being proactive now, addressing the issues while you have the capacity to do so, setting up these safeguards we've talked about, are all things that can help you address the issues proactively before the undue influence is tried to be exerted upon you. And the other thing I wanted to mention, because it was an announcement yesterday, the IRS has a new program out there. They had offered it to people who had been subjected to identity theft. And, as we're older and we have people coming in our homes and assisting us with chores, they're able to gain access to information that can assist them in engaging in identity theft. So one of the things the IRS was seeing, people filing fraudulent tax returns to get individuals refunds. So they've now opened up nationwide a voluntary program where you can annually apply for an individual personal identification number that you would use when filing your income tax return. And you have to go through a lot of steps to do this, but it is a mechanism that might help prevent people from stealing your tax refunds. So,
Sandy, thank you. It's interesting. My wife and I just got our personal identity numbers for filing our tax returns in the mail yesterday, actually.
Okay,
Sandra
good.
Glazier, it's been a pleasure as always. You're a wonderful, and great guest, and I want to thank you so much for being our guest on Gracefully Graying. I want to thank our viewers for watching Gracefully Graying, and please visit our Gracefully Graying YouTube channel, and also, of course, gracefullygraying.com for the videos and articles and blogs that are being loaded and entered every day. Thank you again, Sandy.
Thank you, Henry.